Are we recording right now?
Rich, we're always recording, except for the last 7 weeks.
Hey, yeah. Wi-Fi wasn't good in Thailand.
Now we look like we should be holding up a newspaper and giving proof of life to people.
I'm going to go there.
Welcome to the show, where air takes the flow. Lee and Rich on the mic.
Welcome to the AI Guys podcast, where we make artificial intelligence easy to understand for everyone. I'm your host, Lee Dixon, and as always, I'm joined by fellow evicted businessman, Rich Swire.
That was a huge welcome.
You just haven't heard it in so long because we've been off while you gallivanted around Asia.
Jeez, I know.
I'm excited to be here with you.
Scared me.
In our dark void that we have.
Yeah, you like this? This is our new thing. We're in the virtual metaverse right now.
I don't love it, but I don't hate it.
I love it. Look at it. It's just like outer space. It's like what it's like to be an astronaut.
This is what Katy Perry and all of them just did, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we go to the moon.
It's all just Blue Horizon.
Mm-hmm. You just gotta embrace it.
Yeah, and for everybody that obviously hasn't seen us for a couple weeks, we apologize, but Rich was traveling, and we are ready to dive right back into what's been changing in the ever-changing AI space. So today, Rich, we're actually going to talk a little bit about language models, just doing a quick check-in on them and kind of touching on what's right for a specific business and when to use certain models. So I think we should kind of jump right in. There have been some updates. I know you're big on Manus, and we'll kind of talk about that in here too, really in topic 2. But, we've learned over the last, year or so that as models continue to change and iterate faster and faster, still not all models are built for the same tasks.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important it's been a while since we've talked about the space race where you have all these different hyperscalers building out different models. But I think kind of as we predicted, 6 or so months ago, you start to see these models have specific use cases, right? And it's not just like one model solves everything. In fact, a lot of the models now, in case of like when we deploy like an agentic solution, we're using multiple models for different use cases, for different purposes, whether because of cost or speed or whatever it might be. So I like to look at it, kind of in a 3 ways that I kind of look at each model when we're deploying out solutions and figuring out which one we're going to use. And obviously our go-to foundational models are in the OpenAI universe, primarily because that's what our platform uses as its kind of core foundational layer. So we'll kind of start with them, but then I'll kind of parallel into some other ones. So the 3 aspects of models that you always want to consider, the first one, which is typically probably the most important one, which is the actual use case that you're allocating it for. So if you're using it, for example, on one extreme to do high-end reasoning, you're wanting to do you want the AI to take its time to really think through the problem, assess the questions that you're asking, maybe even have somewhat of a conversational element to it to get to a more verbose, more kind of what I would call novel answer. Then that's one side of the models where obviously you have OpenAI has released quite a few models in that world where it's more powerful on the reasoning side, like in the O1s and so forth. And then on the other side, you might have it just be more task oriented or specific, more fine-tuned into the use case. So for example, it might just be instructional prompting that you're using, where you could use one of the smaller models like a mini model or even something that's a lot doesn't require that much reasoning in that case. But still, you want to first start off with like your use case. And I'll dive into a little bit more of this in a second when I compare OpenAI with some of the other models, like some of the tools that we're using, like Manus, which is using DeepSeek, and then of course Google as well. And then the second way that I look at models is speed is like your next thing. So speed does come into consideration when you're thinking about either, let's say you're building out a customer support agent, or you're building out a sales agent, or you might be building out something that's maybe something that helps you with coding. And then of course the channel that you're using, whether it be if you're using a live chat, or if you're kind of in an in-app experience, or if you're using voice, speed has a very major factor on it. Because if your user is expecting to get immediate responses, otherwise the experience starts to decay, then you want to make sure speed is a top priority. So we've played around with a variety of different models when it comes to, for example, voice applications, where you have to choose the ones that have the minimum delay, right? Because latency becomes an issue with voice. Now, if you're using email or SMS, then a multi-second delay is not too dissimilar to what a human would take, so it's not as big of a deal. Yeah. And so like when you're thinking about those kind of use case or use cases, then speed does kind of come into factor. So we find ourselves actually using the smaller models, maybe in some cases the older models like 4 Turbo for voice instead of some of the newer models, because they have much more latency. Some of the cloud models are faster and operate quicker, especially their Sonnet and smaller models that they have. And then in some cases, even using some of the smaller Facebook models, some of the meta models as well, Llama. And then the third piece that we always look at from what vector you're taking to understand and best choose your model is going to be cost, obviously. So, if you're doing high volume, high transactional, relatively predictable queries that are coming into your AI, let's say you're doing like a sales agent, and that sales agent is talking to thousands of prospects. Well, then you have to consider you might have token usage there that you want to manage and monitor, and you want to manage your cost. However, the cost for these models are so,
it's relatively inexpensive.
Relatively inexpensive. So, you never really have a hard time justifying cost when it comes to model usage and token usage. But again, if you're at scale and you are thinking long term, and you're something that might be running a high volume of tokens, you want to consider that. For example, if you're doing a content generation agent, and let's say you're generating thousands of pieces of content a day or even an hour, well, then cost would come into consideration there. So when you think about it, use case, price, cost, and speed are kind of like your core pillars of how you would go about making the decision.
I was going to say the need for nuance that I've noticed, most of the time when we're talking about early stage AI adopters, they do see all of these things on the shelf, and they're trying to figure out like, oh, where do I need to spend a lot of my time? And I do think it's really just, if it's lightweight, it's going to be something that is there for summarization, quick support answers. Like, it's not doing a ton of like multimodal tasks like the advanced models would be that you're talking about. I also think too, is that, one thing we've beat the drum on a ton over, the last year since, when this episode's coming out, we'll have been doing this for a year, Rich, if that makes you feel any better, is the fact that everything just continues to improve and improve and improve every, it used to be every 6 months. Now it feels like it's almost every other week. You're hearing some different adjustments that are taking place, and voice is one of them. So when you're breaking it down, it's not necessarily, choosing a model on day one that you're going to stick with forever. Sometimes, your use case might evolve, and it either becomes a multi-agent solution where there's going to be other pieces of it that need to access advanced models because they're providing a piece of output that is complex, content generation. Whereas the actual like process that's taking place of the workflow might all be lightweight models or like in workflow models, just because their job is not as complex as the totality of what that workload is going to be.
Yeah, when we're building out solutions, there's it's more common than not that you have multiple, either multiple models or multiple agents that are working in tandem, and some of them are just doing task monkey stuff, which you can use smaller models that are faster and cranking out tokens at a higher rate, and then some of the models you want it to actually stop, think, process. Maybe the input is a little bit more complicated and it requires those models. Now, another thing that you should probably note before we go on to talking about some of the other use cases that we've been seeing, how models have evolved, is how models are obviously AI in general is not a deterministic technology, right? It is AI. It doesn't produce the same result every time. It takes in consideration a lot of factors. As you mentioned, the models are evolving and changing also the inputs and outputs, and the thread and the context of the conversation can change its output and input. So even when you're talking to one specific model in one specific instance, it might be a slightly different experience than somebody else talking to that model, right? But it gets even more nuanced when choosing these models. Is another aspect that we started to learn is that if you set up with the same instructional prompting, with the same context, for example, OpenAI's 4.0 model, and you put that same basically context and instructional prompting into like 4.1 or 0.3, you're going to have a completely different answer.
Also, shame on ChatGPT and OpenAI for making all of their models like so similar. I know that's a thing that annoys a lot of our clients that we talk to, is just like they get confused with, 4.1 versus 4.1 mini and nano versus 0.3 and 0.1. It's just
all the different names. Yeah.
They could have done a better job with that, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. We got to talk to them about that. But
make a quick call.
I'm sure they're going to care. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the most important point there is, if you're building out agentic workflows, or if you're building out a system that depends on this agent, especially if you're expecting the output to be of some similar format, like let's say you're wanting to output to be something that you're in a workflow, you can take and pass it on to a different agent, or pass it on to an API, to a software product, or whatever it might be. You have to realize, like, as the models evolve and change, that output could change as well. And so to think about that when you're building out these agentic solutions is that it's not like software you just upgrade. Oh, I was on, Windows 98. Now I'm on Windows 2001, and everything kind of works, and we just upgrade and all the software still works. And there's models aren't like that. They're not upgrades.
Right.
They are very much independent and ever evolving entities where, in many cases we'll try to use, for example, 0.3 or a 4.1 model for a use case, but the output is not what we need or not what we want. For a variety of reasons. So we kind of default back to another model, which simplifies it. So this is another
specific
nuance.
Models for specific tasks. That's the way to kind of approach it.
Yeah. But also, just if you're expecting, let's say you had a task, you're like, oh, I could use 4.0, or I could use 0.3 mini, or I could use 4.1. But you run your prompt through there and you run your window through there. You're still going to, and you're expecting the output to be somewhat similar, just because, even if, because maybe all three can support your specific use case, expect the output to be completely different. And that could be a concern. Like we use, great example is we use, models quite a bit to generate content, but we upgraded a lot of our models that were based on the 4.0 up to 4.1, thinking, oh, it's it's a substantially smarter, whatever, has a lot more value to, maybe the output is a bit more robust. Right. But the reality is the output was completely different. It kind of acted differently. It was kind of frustrating to figure it out so we ended up going back to 4.0 because just couldn't manipulate the AI to do it the way that we used to do it. So I guess my point is, if you're going to upgrade the models or you're going to change your model, expect to change more than your model. You're going to have to change your prompting, and you're going to have to change your expected output, and potentially have to change your input.
Yeah. And we'll talk about the tech stack on another episode and kind of how some of these pieces change, because obviously, there's other layers to it. But right now, as far as just giving a quick breakdown on, some of the models that we talked about with 4.0, 0.3, Manus. I mean, there's other ones worth watching as well, like in the Anthropic family, and like you mentioned with DeepSeek. So what are some of the specific ones that you feel, some of the listeners should be paying attention to if they're currently looking at leveraging AI inside of a business, or maybe they already have some use cases in mind, but they're really not sure like which model is going to be the right fit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we started doing, and we started doing this a lot back when OpenAI's kind of started getting into the reasoning side of things, the models that are a little bit more sophisticated. And what we realized is that for a lot of the development of our agents, we started using the reasoning models to produce better training materials, right? So we would, we kind of toggle back and forth between, okay, this model is actually going to go do the work when we actually go live and build an autonomous agent. But in order for it to be trained and do it the right way, we're going to use the more advanced models to build out the instructional prompting. It also convert existing training materials or source materials into a better format so that it can, the functional model, the functional agent can actually do a better job. And so it's interesting. It led us down this path where we started using OpenAI's O3 to do this, and some of the more reasoning stuff. And then we stumbled on Manus, which is obviously using the DeepSeek model.
Yeah,
and
you're a big Manus proponent. You like it a lot.
yeah,
You
I
like
mean,
the output though, right? That's one of the main reasons.
it does. I really didn't understand how different it was, but it definitely takes a completely different approach to how it takes your input and your prompting and what it delivers. I would say that it in most cases it over delivers. It almost kind of goes above and beyond what you actually need. And in some cases it kind of is a little bit too much and you have to kind of wind it down, but obviously through prompting or just through manual effort. But like ultimately what was really interesting where we are on the path of like how we train agents and how we really think about when we think of a knowledge base or we think of multiple channels of data that we have to bring into an agent. We started using OpenAI and Manus as kind of tools to help us understand how to speak to these different models. And so that was the thing I wanted to highlight kind of a little bit in this episode because it's new to us. And even though we've been doing it more out of habit, more out of kind of just like curiosity, but it's actually become more formalized in how we approach model.
Additional level of checking and QC.
Yeah. And also just transforming, let's say, for example, you're building out an agent that is going to be trained on a series of PDF documents or PowerPoints or whatever it might be. And most people might just like throw those raw documents into a vector database and expect the functional model to know what to do with it. And so what we figured out is it actually ends up not really working in a high performance and a high efficacy. And so what you have to do is you have to kind of run it through the more sophisticated model, tell the sophisticated model to take this source data, convert it into like Markdown or JSON or whatever format is going to, and then also tell it what model is going to ultimately use it. So it's a really interesting dynamic where you can no longer just be model agnostic. You have to start thinking about like when you say I'm going to use this model to execute this task or to build this agent or to do whatever I need to do, and you have to almost use it in your way that you end up training and building that model. Obviously, if you're just using instructional prompting, it's probably a little bit more flexible, but we've also found, even in instructional prompting, which is very little amount of text, very little, it's not as advanced as like uploading like large volumes of documents that are a variety of formats. But when you're even talking about instructional prompting, we discovered that we can't take the same instructional prompting that you used in your 4.0 agent and put it in your 4.1 agent and expect it to operate the same way. So what we're doing is we're using these higher end models to convert and help us upgrade or help us convert the training materials and or instructional prompting from one model to another. And that was something that
compress it to make it more efficient. Yeah.
So I think the point of this episode is, yes, of course, everybody is looking at different models for different purposes, and they're starting to experiment and understand what this model can do versus this model. And within the ChatGPT environment or within the Manus UI, it's certainly easy to toggle back and forth and play around. And it probably feels like you're just kind of talking to different elevations of AI. But the reality is when you start looking at building agents and AI agentic solutions, that you're deploying this out into the wild, where you do have to have a much more deterministic, because it might be tied into workflow. Start thinking about how you can use these tools to transform and help train your AI agents, as well as maybe even develop prompts or GPTs that for your own personal use that are specifically tied to these models to get to maximize your ROI and maximize, of course, the efficacy and their output, because it is crazy how much they are different.
Yeah, there's lots of layers to the cake, right, Rich?
Keep adding layers to the cake.
We're at a 12-layer cake at this point.
At some point, yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, for everyone, thanks again for joining us on this episode. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to stay in touch. Also, check out our Substack for more content, which we link to this episode to continue this discussion. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everyone.
Welcome to the show, where air takes the floor. Leah Rich on the mic.